Alrighty, we are in chapter 5 tonight. We are rapidly closing in on the halfway mark. Next week, God willing, and additional creeks don't rise. And before we get started, I want to play a video that I forgot to play last time. I actually have no idea what this thing even is, but I found it on YouTube, and I thought it's all computer animated. Well, not all of it. There's actually some modern day pictures of both the ruins of ancient Baghdad and a lot of what Saddam Hussein rebuilt back in the 90s. But it gives some really good depictions. Obviously, a lot of it is artist's interpretation, but a lot of it is dead on. You know, as you study the maps of where things were and what we think things looked like and the walls and so forth, this really looked like a pretty good reconstruction to me, and so I thought just for fun we would look at that. If I can figure out which one it is here. This is some kind of advertisement. I don't know if it was for a movie or a video game or what, but so this, I think, is Nebuchadnezzar, and this is him rising to power and conquering the surrounding nations and so forth. This is from the Gulf War. Pretty sure they didn't have catapults, but this is the Babylonians conquering Jerusalem at one of the sieges. There's the temple in Jerusalem. Some of the reconstruction today. This is the Temple of Antemenaki, Temple to Marduk in the center of town. This is actually the tomb of Cyrus, who we're going to talk about tonight. And this is the museum in Berlin where the Ishtar Gate. This is part of the original Ishtar Gate. This is the processional way down through the center of town, leading up to and through the Ishtar Gate. This would be Nebuchadnezzar returning home. There's the Ishtar Gate as it in its fullness. Part of a reconstruction. Some of the temples And there's about 10 or 12 different temples that have been uncovered within the walls. Statue of Marduk at the top of the main temple, the patron god of Babylon. Yeah, so that never actually happened, but I don't know what that's all about. I think that's it, yeah. Anyway, I thought that was kind of fun. If we've got time at the end tonight, we've got another movie about Cyrus.
Now, in that video, did it show parts that had been restored by Saddam Hussein, or was
Yeah, all of that modern day stuff. I mean, you see some that are still in ruins, and then some that are kind of halfway reconstructed, and some that are full. All that was done by Saddam Hussein. So he hired archaeologists not only from the Iraqi Antiquities Association or whatever they're called, but he actually brought in people from all over the world to figure out, not only to excavate more of ancient Babylon, but also to come together and develop plans to rebuild exactly the way that it was, or as close as he could. But he was interrupted partway through the construction project and never quite got back to it. So. All right, so Daniel chapter 5. Once again, I'm just going to read through the chapter to get a feel for where we're at, and then we'll come back and take things apart. One of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible. Amazing, amazing story. Especially to find out what else is going on behind the scenes. While the description of chapter 5 takes place, we actually have an enormous amount of secular history that tells us exactly what was going on this night from other people's points of view. But we'll get back to that. All right, chapter 5, verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. And while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Big mistake. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him. Gotta love the Bible's understatements. His thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and the king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Important verse there. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. And this is actually the queen mother, probably Nebuchadnezzar's widow, Belshazzar's grandmother. We'll come back to that. She came to the banquet hall, and the queen spoke, saying, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king," she's kind of twisting the knife there a little bit, "made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up, and whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar," it's actually grandson, but the term is the same in the Chaldean, "have not humbled yourself, although you knew all of this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him," from God, "and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And this is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, I'll come back to why that's different. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians." Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. All right. Fabulous, colorful story. One of the best known, one of the most colorful in all of Scripture, really. This is one from Sunday school. I mean, those that grew up in the church have heard this story undoubtedly many times. Daniel's filled with these colorful chapters, but this one stands out for many reasons. So first of all, a little bit of history since between chapters 4 and 5. Quite a bit of time has elapsed. Nebuchadnezzar died in the year 562 BC, just 1 year after the end of chapter 4, after he regained his sanity and the kingdom was restored to him. He had reigned in Babylon for 43 years. His immediate successor was his own son, a guy by the name of Evil Merodach. It's not the kind of evil like we think, that it's the Chaldean name. I don't remember what it means, but it has the names of some Babylonian god in it. This actually shows up in 2 Kings and in Jeremiah, but he shows up in history, in archaeology as well. We know him historically as Amel Marduk, which, strange as it may sound, is actually the same language. Remember, well, you may not know, in both Hebrew and Chaldean there are no vowels. It's just consonants. The vowels are implied in the old days based on the context. Later on, they developed a system of pointing where you see these little dots and lines above and below the letters that tell you what vowels go in there. But the actual Hebrew alphabet, aleph-bet, doesn't have any vowels in it. And so, depending on which vowels you put in, sometimes you can get very different sounding words, and that's kind of what's going on here between Evil Merodach and Amel Marduk. Anyways, he only reigned for 2 years, and he's killed by a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar called Neriglissar. Through a military coup, he seizes the throne in August of 560 BC, and he reigns for about 4 years. He's probably the Nergal-Sharezer that is referred to in Jeremiah 39, who holds this particular office in Jerusalem in 586 BC. Anyway, Neriglissar dies, and he's replaced by his son, Labashi Marduk, who only reigns for 2 months before he's murdered by conspirators, including Nabonidus. Nabonidus then brings us to chapter 5. Nabonidus takes the throne of Babylon, and he really goes a long way toward restoring Babylon to its greatness after this series of really lousy rulers. He assumes the throne in 556 BC. He's actually the last independent ruler of Babylon, and he's technically the king during chapter 5. Even though it says that Belshazzar is the king. We'll come back to that in just a sec. But Nabonidus has kind of a colorful history, and at some point he actually alienates the priesthood, and they are very unhappy with him. And in fear for his life, he actually leaves Babylon, and he goes off to be with his mother in Haran, if I'm not mistaken, which is considerably farther up north. Haran shows up first. That's the place where Abraham got stuck. Remember, Abraham started in Ur of the Chaldees, which is very close to where Babylon is, and traveled up around that Fertile Crescent and then down into Israel, to the land of promise that God had showed him. But he gets stuck for a number of years up in this little city called Haran, actually until his father dies. His father, Terah, dies in Haran. And it's not until then that he leaves. But anyways, that's where Nabonidus spends about 10 of the 17 years of his reign, is up there in Haran. So in his place, he leaves his son, Belshazzar. So he grants him the authority. He's kind of a regent king, if you want to think of him that way, appointed to act in the office of king by Nabonidus. And so when Daniel begins, it refers to Belshazzar as the king. Well, I'm going to read a quote from Dr. John Whitcomb, professor of theology of the Old Testament at Grace Theological Seminary, from one of the commentaries about this. He says, "For over 2,000 years, the book of Daniel contained the only known historical reference to Belshazzar, and was roundly criticized. Everybody thought that the book of Daniel couldn't be right because it referred to Belshazzar as king, and everybody knew archaeologically that Nabonidus was the king during that period. So Daniel had to be wrong. For over 2,000 years, the book of Daniel was criticized for that reason. But in the late 19th century, some cuneiform tablets that refer to Belshazzar, which means Bel protect the king, as the son of the king, Marshari, were unearthed. In the early 20th century, a tablet was published stating that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his son when he went to Arabia, in other words, up to Haran, indicating that he was the de facto king of Babylon. Belshazzar was the de facto king of Babylon when it fell. It is significant that Belshazzar's highest offer to Daniel was to make him the third ruler of the kingdom. Okay? So the clues were all there the whole time. The critics just didn't pay attention to it until, lo and behold, the archaeologists dig up a tablet that says exactly what Daniel's been saying for 2,500 years. There was a book that was written about all of the things in Daniel that were originally criticized and then later archaeologically confirmed. The book is called Daniel in the Critics' Den. But in light of archaeological discoveries over the past 100 years, Daniel has become the most well-authenticated book in all of the Old Testament since then. It's great fun to go back through that history. Okay, so moving forward, we've got the other forward. Guy by the name of Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus comes to power in a different kingdom, the Persians, the Medes and the Persians. There are two empires, the Medes and the Persians, and Cyrus actually brings them together and forms what historically today we call the Medo-Persian Empire. If you've ever heard that, Cyrus is the one who pulls that together. And he kind of rises to greatness as Babylon is beginning to kind of decline under these lousy kings. And it's at this point, a couple of battles have taken place that we'll come back to. Babylon actually begins to be defeated in battle as Cyrus is rising to power. And we are at the eve of the fall of Babylon, not just as a city, but as an empire. And the advent, the dawn, if you will, of the Medo-Persian Empire. That's what's happening at the beginning of Daniel chapter 5. So Cyrus rules from 559 to 530. He's the founder of the Persian Empire that lasted for more than 2 centuries, the empire, not Cyrus. It lasts all the way until Alexander the Great in roughly 330 AD, when Alexander, in this amazing military campaign, takes over the entire world. Literally, by the time he's like 23 years old. It's just incredible, his rise to power. And so the Persian Empire lasts from this moment when they finally conquer Babylon, which is the ruling empire at the time, until Alexander succeeds. This will become very important, that succession. We'll come back to that and we'll deal with that in more detail when we get into prophecies in the next few chapters. So Cyrus successfully unites the Median Empire and Persia. Both armies fought under his leadership and conquered the bulk of the known world. At the fall of Babylon, Cyrus's empire becomes the largest empire ever known to that time. Here's a little bit about Cyrus the Great. And that's his tomb. We're pretty sure there's an inscription on the side that says this is Cyrus' tomb. And we think that's authentic. In fact, I think that's this in yellow here is actually what it says on the side of the tomb. 6th century BC tomb at Pasargadae, which is in modern-day Iran. You can go visit this. I want a round-trip ticket if you do. And so we're going to come back to this mention of Cyrus in Isaiah 45. Isaiah actually writes a chapter. God writes a letter to Cyrus 150 years before he's born. We'll come back to that. About exactly what's happening in Daniel chapter 5. Yeah. All right, so in the summer of 450 BC, Cyrus is running around conquering the world, and he kind of has left Babylon, the city of Babylon, till the end, till the last big thing to conquer. Herodotus, again, I've done a lot of quotes from him. Two of my favorite non-biblical sources of history are Herodotus and Josephus. These guys, Herodotus, did I write it in there? I think he lives in the neighborhood of 500 BC, so he's right in this time period. He actually visited Babylon, or so he claims. Josephus lives in the 1st century AD, shortly after the time of Christ's crucifixion. So I've got some quotes in here we're going to go through from these guys telling about what else is going on behind the scenes as Daniel chapter 5 unfolds. So leading up to this time, the previous summer, the summer of 540 BC, Cyrus is running around with his army conquering the known world. And they come up to a river called the Gindis, which you can look up today. Modern day name is the Diyala. It's just north of Baghdad, leads into the Tigris River. I don't think I put any maps in here. Sorry, Sherry. Should have put a map in here just for you. And they come to this river, and it's a big river. It's during the summer. Probably the spring rains are emptying out of the mountains. And one of his favorite white stallions decides he's going to cross the river, and he gets swept downstream and gets killed in the river. And Cyrus is so angry at the insolence of the river, Herodotus actually records this, that he decides he's going to break the power of the river. And he spends the entire summer with his army digging canals in order to reroute the river and break the spirit of the river. And there's a quote in here. It says, do I have that? In a rage at the river's insolence, he vowed to break its power such that a woman could cross it without a struggle. That's what he tells his army. That's what they're going to do. And he spends the entire summer having his army dig a series of 360 canals and a basin, 180 on each side of the river, and a basin into which the river could be routed to lower the level and and create a ford so that it could be crossed at that spot where the horse died. And he does it. He's successful. Previously, you could only get across it in boats, but he taught that river a lesson. So the next spring, 539, remember in BC we're counting down, the next spring there is a battle in a city called Opis, which is actually modern-day Baghdad, which is just outside of Babylon. It's about 60 miles north and slightly to the west of where Babylon is. That's modern-day Baghdad. And there's a battle that takes place there where the Babylonian army fights against Cyrus and his army, and Cyrus wins. This is pretty unusual for the Babylonians to lose, but this is kind of the beginning of the end. Well, this is very close to the end for them. But they retreat back inside the city. Now, inside the city walls, as we talked about last week, they are safe. They've got enough, obviously they've got water because the Euphrates flows right through the middle of it, and they've got food provisions for the entire city for 20 years. And remember, these walls are 90 feet high at least, possibly hundreds, depending on which historian you choose to believe. They're set. They are not worried once they're inside the walls. So we are now at the end of that. So we're in October 29th of 539 BC. So we are 70 years after the first siege of Nebuchadnezzar, when Daniel was taken captive. 66 years. We're very rapidly coming to the completion of the full 70 years. Remember, if Daniel was about 15 at that time, that makes him about 81 years old. So in Daniel chapter 5, Daniel is an old man. He's retired. That when the Queen Mother remembers him and sends for him, they're kind of bringing him out of retirement. He's 81 years old, about. All right, so at this point then, Cyrus is stuck. He's outside the walls of Babylon. Babylon is the last great fortress, but he isn't quite sure what he's going to do. So Herodotus records for us, and I'm just going to read this. This is a section of his description of what happens at this point. So Cyrus was now reduced to great perplexity as time went on, and he made no progress against the place, Babylon. In this distress, either someone made the suggestion to him, or he bethought himself of a plan which he proceeded to put into execution. He placed a portion of his army at the point where the river enters the city. So this is at the south end, I believe, the Euphrates. No, the north end. The Euphrates flows to the south down into the Persian Gulf. So at the north end of the city, just outside the walls, he places a portion of his army, and another body at the back of the place where it issues forth, where the south end, where it comes back out of the city. Remember, there's gigantic gates that close to complete the walls all the way across the river. So this river, the Euphrates, is gigantic. It's akin to the Mississippi or the Ohio. Giant river, okay, that these gates are closed across. Hundreds of feet wide. Don't know exactly at that time, but the historians record that I've forgotten now how many stadia across. It's big. Nobody's getting under the gates. Okay. So Cyrus puts a portion of his army at the north end, a portion at the south end, with orders to march into the town by the bed of the stream as soon as the water becomes shallow enough. He then himself withdrew off with the unwarlike portion of his host. In other words, they're traveling with a giant entourage, much of which is his army. He divides his army in two and leaves them at either end of the city, and he takes the rest with him up north to a place where Nitrachus dug the basin for the river. So there's a whole story behind this, but something similar happened as what he did the summer before when he broke the other river. Another person had done something kind of like that. I mean, it wasn't nearly as good. Anyways, there's a series of canals for the Euphrates to be rerouted that Cyrus takes off up north, and he turned the Euphrates by a canal into the basin, which was then a marsh, on which the river sank to such an extent that the natural bed of the stream became fordable. Hereupon, the Persians who had been left for the purpose at Babylon by the riverside entered the stream, which had now sunk so as to reach about midway up a man's thigh, and thus they got into the town. Had the Babylonians been apprised of what Cyrus was about, or had they noticed their danger, they would never have allowed the Persians to enter the city, but would have destroyed them utterly, for they would have made fast all the street gates which gave upon the river, and mounting upon the walls along both sides of the stream, would so have caught the enemy as it were in a trap. But as it was, the Persians came upon them by surprise, and so took the city. Owing to the vast size of the place, the inhabitants of the central part, as the residents at Babylon declare, long after the outer portions of the town were taken, knew nothing of what had chanced. But as they were engaged in a festival, continued dancing and reveling until they learnt of the capture, but too certainly. Such then were the circumstances of the taking of Babylon. All right, so Cyrus goes up north, reroutes the Euphrates River. The river level drops to about the height of a thigh, and both sets of his army, divisions of his army, were then able by night to enter the gates. So he had also, another historian by the name of Xenophon tells us that Cyrus intentionally waited for this festival. This was an annual festival. We're not exactly sure which. Some people think it might have been Belshazzar's birthday. More likely, it was an annual feast to the god Marduk, which was a gigantic city festival. So Cyrus waits until the first night of the festival, when he knows everybody's going to be partying and drunk, and then he waits until the wee hours of the morning, and under cover of darkness, they lower the river and his soldiers go in and begin taking the city. But as Herodotus records, the city is so big that the inhabitants in the central part of the city don't even know that the city's been taken for several days afterward. They're still partying and drunk and what have you. You can just imagine the scene. All right, so that brings us to the beginning of chapter 5. This feast has begun. Belshazzar the king makes this great feast. Babylon has been under siege for some time by this point. Remember, Cyrus is beside himself trying to figure out what to do. He's perplexed, as Herodotus said. But Belshazzar isn't worried. Cyrus is stuck. He has made no progress against the city for a long time. The annual feast comes along. Belshazzar says, we're not worried about them, let's party. Which is exactly what Cyrus was counting on. And the king, Belshazzar, is in his banquet room. Now, this banquet room has been discovered. It's been excavated. In fact, I believe it's been rebuilt by Saddam. It's about 55 feet by 165 feet long. It's a gigantic portion of the palace. And what they dug up actually has plastered walls, just as the Bible says. The Bible refers to the handwriting on the plaster of the wall opposite the lampstand. Okay? As far as I know, they didn't find any writing on the wall, but they did find this plastered banquet hall. All right, so while they're drinking and reveling, Belshazzar makes probably the greatest mistake of his career. He's not been a very good ruler up to this point. He's obviously dropped his guard. He underestimates his adversary, but then he gets arrogant in the face of God. And now remember, 66 years ago, Nebuchadnezzar had taken the implements, gold and silver implements, out of the temple in Jerusalem at the first siege when Daniel was taken captive. And he brought them back and he placed them in his own temple to Marduk, which is kind of a museum at this point. Belshazzar knows this, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and sends people to go get these holy instruments from the Jerusalem temple and bring them to the party. He and his wives and his concubines and his buddies are going to drink wine in honor of Marduk out of those implements. Josephus records this same event and adds something the Bible doesn't say, so we're not certain, but it's fairly good authority. But he adds, not only were they drinking out of these vessels, but they were also blaspheming the name of God, the Jewish God, our God. How dumb can you get? As they're doing this, the hand appears. Now, we don't know exactly, much about this. Obviously, it'd make a great movie, which nobody seems to have been successful at creating so far. It says the fingers of a man's hand. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but some portion of a disembodied hand appears and begins writing these words on the wall. And apparently, it's not just a ghostly image. The words are actually carved into the wall. They stay there until all of the rest of the chapter takes place. Now, you won't find this in any commentaries. This is purely Tim Miller's idea, but I find it fascinating that we are specifically told not just the fingers of a hand, but the fingers of a man's hand. Okay? I find that very significant. Why? Anybody want to take a guess? We're told that the apparition, the fingers, the hand, was sent by God. if it's the hand of God, who is the only member of the Trinity that has the hand of a man? Jesus Christ. Can't prove it. Don't see any agreement with me in the commentators, but I believe Jesus himself is there to announce the judgment of his enemy. And in the typology of this, with the Antichrist and the end times and all the stuff that's going on, that makes a whole lot of sense as well. So I just throw that out. Some of my favorite verses in the chapter. The king's countenance was changed. You can imagine this was a definite downer. Kind of brought a halt to the celebration at this point, as this ghostly hand appears and begins writing on the wall. And it says, verse 6 there is just an amazing understatement we can imagine. The king's countenance changed and his thoughts troubled him. So that, and here's the clue, don't miss what this really means. This is the polite King James English coming through. It says, his thoughts troubled him so that the joints of his hips were loosened. Make no mistake of what's going on here. Okay? The original King James says the joints of his loins were loosened, which is a little bit more descriptive. So without going into graphic detail, I'm going to tell the same story that Chuck Missler tells to illustrate what's going on here. So there's a famous story about Lord Nelson, who's the admiral, the chief admiral of the British Navy during the Napoleonic Wars, and it's Lord Nelson who actually defeats Napoleon at the Battle of Trafalgar. That's why Trafalgar Square exists in downtown London, and the giant monument with Nelson on top and all this stuff. Anyways, the legend goes that Lord Nelson was on his flagship. They were out at sea. They were cruising up and down the English Channel. And at one point, the boatswain runs into his cabin and yells, Lord Nelson, there's a Spanish frigate on the horizon." Lord Nelson calmly and coolly stands up, says, "Very well." He says, "Get me my red waistcoat and sound general quarters." So they go off to battle and they sink the frigate and all is well. So a week later, boatswain comes running back into his chambers again and says, Lord Nelson, there are 2 cruisers off the port bow." Lord Nelson stands up calmly and says, "Very well." Says, "Get me my red waistcoat and sound general quarters." They go off and they sink both of the Spanish cruisers. And the cabin boy, after the battle, takes the opportunity to say, "Lord Nelson, if I may speak freely," says, "Granted." Says, "I have a question for you." "Very well, sir. Very well, son. That's how you learn." He says, "I've noticed that every time we are about to go into battle, you always sound general quarters, obviously, but you ask for your red waistcoat. Why is that?" So that's an excellent question, son. He says, "If perchance I should happen to be wounded in battle, I don't want my men to see the blood and be demoralized. So I always wear a red waistcoat when we go into battle." So, "Oh, thank you very much. That makes perfect sense." They go off, and about a week later, the boatswain comes running into the cabin and says, Lord Nelson, the entire Spanish Armada is on the horizon." And Lord Nelson stands up calmly and says, "Very well." He says, "Sound general quarters and get me my brown breeches." That's what's happening here. Okay? That's what it means when it politely says that his thoughts troubled him so that the joints of his hips were loosened. And his knees, again, you can't improve upon the King James. The King James says, his knees smote one upon the other. His knees knocked. All right. So the king cries aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldee. We've seen this twice before. He brings in all of his advisors, and nobody has any clue. This time, these guys, for some reason, nobody knows quite what this is, but the ancient sources may give us a clue. But for some reason, they can't even read what's been written on the wall. It's not a matter of just not being able to interpret it. It says they can't read it. The Jewish Talmud, which are the rabbinical teachings of Judaism that were created after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It's kind of when Judaism was reinvented. It now follows the Talmud rather than the Mosaic Law. So in the Talmud, which also provides a commentary on the Old Testament, it states that the letters were written vertically instead of, Hebrew or Chaldean in this case, is normally written from right to left. But in this case, it was written vertically and backwards. And in this is a famous painting by Rembrandt back in the, 1600s. This is called Belshazzar's Feast. 1636 was when this was about, somewhere in that neighborhood. I think I've got another picture this may be, according to the Talmud, this may be the way that the letters were actually written. Now I know this is in Hebrew rather than Chaldean, but M-N-A is many, many, T-Q-L, tekel, U, or Vav. This is a P-H-R-S-Y, and there's a noon, an N behind the hand here. So many, many, tekel, and then Upharsin is broken into two parts here. But that may be why they were having trouble reading it. They were trying to read it this way, like you would normally read Hebrew or Chaldean. Whatever the reason, they weren't able to read it. The Queen Mother, Belshazzar's grandmother, probably. Now, it's possibly his mother, but most sources believe, and I don't know what the peculiarities are of the text at this point, but most of the commentators seem to believe that this is actually Nebuchadnezzar's widow, Belshazzar's grandmother. She remembers Daniel, and what we seem to have hinted at in the text here is that Daniel is legend by this point, and that makes perfect sense. Everybody's heard the stories of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar's insanity. The whole world would have known of these stories. And if the extra biblical sources are correct, Daniel was the one who was actually the caretaker, and maybe the word escapes me, but the substitute king, the one who, what do you call that?
The steward?
Kind of. Yeah, that's not exactly right, but that's the idea. Someone who took the authority and kind of kept things running in the king's absence would have been Daniel. And then that Nebuchadnezzar actually gets saved, and the relationship that's there. So Daniel survives. He's an old man by this point, but he's undoubtedly legend. And Belshazzar himself says, I've heard of you. It's probably not from what his mother just said. Probably everybody has heard of Daniel. So Daniel is summoned, and he comes in, and he doesn't pull any punches at all. He speaks very, very highly, as did Belshazzar's grandmother. In fact, she even twists the knife a little bit. In some sense, she's actually calling him a real king. Where is that? Queen Mother comes in, O king, live forever, do not let your hearts trouble you. There's a man in whom is the spirit of the holy God. In the days of your father, now the word in Chaldean and Hebrew both, the word father just means ancestor, okay, all the way up the line. Even in Jesus' time, it even comes through in the Greek. As the Pharisees are arguing with Jesus, they say, our father is Abraham, right? Well, that's, 28 generations ago. So same idea here. But the queen says to him, your father, in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, talking about Daniel, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, semicolon, your father the king, as if an insult to him. Okay, you can just kind of catch the venom. Made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers.
NIV says, your father the king, I say.
I say, yeah. Don't miss this. The last guy that was a real king in this empire, you could just catch it. And knowing a little bit of the history, you can kind of catch that background here as well. All right, so they bring in Daniel. Daniel tells them exactly what it says. Many, many tekel upharsin. Many means numbered. Tekel is Wade and Perez, or Phares, this PH here, the same letter will make an F sound or a hard P sound, if I'm not mistaken. So it could be Perez or Phares. So U, or this valve here, is a conjunction. It's the word and. Okay, it's a connector. So numbered, weighed, and divided is Perez. But there's a pun. Again, there's no vowels, but if you use one vowel in Perez, you get the name of the Persians. Okay? If you use a different vowel, you get the word divided. So there's kind of a pun going on here in that this last word means both. Not only is your kingdom going to be divided, but it's actually going to be given to the Persians as well. Those guys outside the walls that are camped round about right now, you're done. So the idea, numbered, in all legitimacy, it means your days are numbered and your number is up. This is where we get those two phrases. Okay? Your days have been numbered by God and your number is now up. It's done. Okay? Tekel, weighed, you have been, Daniel's interpretation here, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Well, not only has he been a lousy king, history records a lot of his missteps and so forth, but what he's just done in the face of God with the implements of the temple and so forth, you've been weighed in the balances by God himself and found wanting. And so, Perez, or Upharsin, Phares, you are done. Your kingdom is divided or broken, same word, splintered, shattered, same idea, and given to the Persians. All right. So, what we read from the outside sources is what has been going on. And there's a whole bunch more in the notes that I'm going to read, but I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from another ancient historian named Xenophon, who wrote a large work about the history of Cyrus. It's called the Cyropedia, and you can actually find the entire text online. It is considered partly fictional. It's kind of a propagandized version of Cyrus that was published after his death. It was probably written around 370 BC by this guy. He's an Athenian gentleman soldier and a student of Socrates, this Xenophon, who writes this. But he writes this history of what's going on right here in chapter 5. He says, so he's talking about Cyrus has gone up north to dig the canals and rerouted them, and it says at last the ditches or canals were completed. Then, when he heard, Cyrus, that a certain festival had come around in Babylon, during which all Babylon was accustomed to drink and revel all night long, Cyrus took a large number of men just as soon as it was dark and opened up the heads of the trenches at the river. As soon as that was done, the water flowed down through the ditches in the night, and the bed of the river where it traversed the city became passable for men. When the problem when the problem of the river was thus solved, Cyrus gave orders to his Persian colonels, infantry and cavalry, to marshal their regiments two abreast and come to him, and the rest, the allies, to follow in the rear, drawn up as before. Now, this is one of the places where Xenophon actually gets it wrong. Cyrus is up north, changing the course of the river. Cyrus doesn't actually enter the city for about a week after this takeover takes place. Instead, he sent his main general, a guy by the name of Ugbaru, and that's the guy that's mentioned in Scripture and that's mentioned in some of the other sources here. So it's not technically Cyrus himself, but it's under Cyrus's orders. So he gave orders, marshaled their regiments two abreast, come in to him, and the rest, the allies to follow in their rear and drawn up as before. They came, according to orders, and he bade his aides, both foot and horse, to get into the dry channel of the river and see if it was passable. In other words, the river has sunk so deep. It's not dry. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but he wants to make sure it's not quicksand. So he sends a few guys in to test the bed of the river to see that it's passable. And it is. They call back. It says, word is brought back that it was. He called together the generals of both the infantry and the cavalry and spoke as follows. So we have his actual words recorded here. Probably the general rather than Cyrus, but he says, my friends, he said, the river has made way for us and given us an entrance into the city. Let us therefore enter in with dauntless hearts. And there's a whole kind of a pep talk here that he gives to the troops and gives them some orders. I'm going to skip through most of that. Then he says, but come to arms, and with the help of the gods, I will lead you on. And to you, Gadatas and Gobryas. So there's a couple of moles. There are a couple of Babylonian turncoats, double agents, traitors, whatever you want to call it. They're actually aiding and abetting the Persian army. And they lead them through the town to the royal palace. And these are their names, Gadatas and Gobryas. He says, you guys show the streets, for you're familiar with them, and when we get inside the walls, lead us by the quickest route to the royal palace. All right, I'm going to skip down a little bit. It says, when these words were spoken, they advanced. And of those they met on the way, some fell by their swords, some fled back into their houses, some shouted to them. And Gobryas and his men shouted back to them as if they were fellow revelers. Hey, great party, isn't it? Yeah, all is well. And it works. And they're able. So, again, I apologize for not putting the map up here, but you may remember when we looked at the map of Babylon itself, as the city flows through from north to south, there are walls along the river as well. So they've gotten into this space in between the walls, but they still have to breach the gates of the city. And through trickery, deception, and the fact that this party is going on, they find some of the gates are open, and others they're able to breach with no problem. But this is what Herodotus was saying. If the Babylonians had had any idea of what was going on, there's no way they could actually have accomplished this. But because Cyrus waited for the cover of darkness and waited for this party and had these traitors with him, this went off like clockwork. It was amazingly, and he boasts about it. We actually have cuneiform cylinder where Cyrus boasts that he takes Babylon without a fight. The impregnable, unbeatable, unconquerable city is taken by Cyrus without a fight. There's some minor skirmishes where a few of the guards actually figured out what was going on, and so some people are killed along the way, but by and large, most people have no idea what's even going on. So Gobryas and Gadatas and their troops found the gates leading to the palace locked, and those who had been appointed to attack the guard fell upon them as they were drinking by a blazing fire. And without waiting, they dealt with them as with foes. They put them to the sword. But the gates to the palace are locked. They've gotten all the way through the city to the royal palace, but the gates are locked. But as a noise and a tumult ensued as they're overcoming the guards, you got to love this. Why isn't this a movie? Those within heard the uproar, and at the king's command to go see what was the matter, some of them opened the gates and ran out. And when Gadatas and his men saw that the gates were open, they dashed in pursuit of the others as they fled back into the palace, and dealing blows right and left, they came into the presence of the king. This is Belshazzar, okay? This is after all this has taken place. Daniel is probably standing there, I'm guessing, already clothed in his purple, and all the events of the interpretation and the handwriting on the wall has taken place. And Belshazzar knows now that his kingdom is over. Don't know if he's changed his pants yet or not. But they run into the presence of the king, and it says they found him already risen with his dagger. Now the word there is probably for scimitar, his sword. Okay, They found him with his dagger in his hand, and Gadatas and Gobryas and their followers overpowered him, and those about the king perished also. One where he had sought some shelter, another while running away, and another while actually trying to defend himself with whatever he could. So here we have, in secular history, from a student of Socrates, a description of exactly how Belshazzar is killed that very night, as the last verse of Daniel tells us. So, as we're reading chapter 5 and the events of Daniel being brought in to interpret, and the handwriting on the wall and the party and all of this stuff is going on, now we have this behind the scenes information about what's been going on during the night. These guys have been infiltrated, coming in, the water level in the river has been dropping. These guys have been coming in under the impenetrable gates of Babylon in force, even with cavalry. They've gotten through the gates, they've overpowered the guards, and they've made it all the way to the royal palace. We don't know what time it is. It's probably very early in the morning by this point. All of the events of chapter 5 have now concluded. And by pure foolishness of the guards at the gate, the gates are flung open wide. Probably divine intervention. God is all over this. And we're about to see that God is the one who actually gives the city into Cyrus's hand. And he told him that he would do that. Cyrus doesn't know this, but God prophesied that he would do this for Cyrus 150 years earlier. We'll come to that shortly. So how can this not be a movie? I mean, you don't get better drama than this. And they'd screw it up if they cannot make a movie about the Bible without changing the story. It's just apparently not possible. While they were thus occupied, Gadatas and Gobryas came up, and first of all they did homage to the gods, seeing that they had avenged themselves upon the wicked king, and then they kissed Cyrus's hands and his feet with many tears of joy. And when the day dawned, those in possession of the citadels discovered that the city was taken, and the king had been slain, and they surrendered the citadels too. So once they find out that the Persians already occupy the key points of the city, they've killed the king, the rest of the guards aren't going to put up a fight. It's done. They just hand over the rest of the city. And I'm not going to read the rest of that. All right, so slide 9. This is the Cyrus cylinder, or the stele of Cyrus. I don't know where the word comes from, but the word S-T-E-L-E is another name for what these things are. This is roughly this big around. It's sitting, I think, in the British Museum. Big chunk out of the backside is gone, but this is cuneiform writing. This was dug up, do I have it written down? I want to say late 1800s or early 1900s during the excavations of Babylon. But this is King Cyrus boasting about all that he's done, and included within this is his boast about taking Babylon without a fight. One particular portion that I'm talking about says, again, this is Cyrus speaking. It says, "When I, well disposed, entered Babylon, I set up the seat of dominion in the royal palace amidst jubilation and rejoicing," the party. "Marduk, the great god, caused the big-hearted inhabitants of Babylon to something me. I sought daily to worship him." What he's talking about here is most of the inhabitants of Babylon, the other historians record, were so disgusted with the line of kings that had come since Nebuchadnezzar that they actually welcomed Cyrus when he came in. And that's what he's talking about. He's now boasting of that. Once they realized they'd been taken over, they had no problem with that. He says, "My numerous troops moved about undisturbed in the midst of Babylon. I did not allow any to terrorize the land of Sumer and Akkad." In other words, he didn't come down on them with an iron boot. It was more of a liberation type of a maneuver. He said, I kept in view the needs of Babylon and all its sanctuaries to promote their well-being. So, all right, let's move on. We're running out of time here. We're out of time. Isaiah chapter 44 and a little bit into 45. Isaiah is the first of the major prophets. It's 3 books before Daniel. But Isaiah lived about 150 years before Daniel. But that chapter is addressed specifically to Cyrus. So this is God speaking through the prophet Isaiah, writing to Cyrus, who hasn't even been born yet. And notice how specifically God predicts exactly what's going to happen. Beginning in verse 27, Isaiah 44:27, he says, who confirms the word of his servant and performs the counsel of his messengers, who says to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited, and to the cities of Judah you shall be built. In other words, God is promising that the captives would be returned, that Jerusalem would be restored after the destruction 70 years ago. Now this is still in Isaiah's future. Isaiah is talking about restoring Jerusalem after a destruction that hasn't happened yet, from Isaiah's point of view. He says, you shall be built, and I will raise up her waste places. Who says to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up your rivers. Who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure. Saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple your foundation shall be laid. So isn't it interesting that God is talking to Cyrus about drying up the rivers? Cyrus thought he did it. Now it gets really intense. Thus says the Lord to his anointed. And he's referring to Cyrus, and he's calling him his anointed. The word in the Hebrew is Messiah, the Mashiach. Now, that's not a proper name. We use it of Christ, but it means anointed. He's using that word of Cyrus. To Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the armor of kings, to open before him the double doors, so that the gates will not be shut. These are the gates of Babylon. Okay? I will go before you and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze and cut the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden riches in secret places, that you may know that I, the Lord, who call you by your name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel my elect, I have even called you by your name. I have named you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. So just like he did with Nebuchadnezzar, his blessing of Cyrus is not because of how great Cyrus is, but rather to bring glory to himself. Cyrus is his instrument, even though Cyrus has never known him up to this point. But history records, secular historians record, that Cyrus was shown this prophecy out of Isaiah, and it impressed him so much that this is why Cyrus lets the captives go. So this has been God's plan all along. And in Ezra, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and the same thing exactly appears again in chapter 6, but in Aramaic. It's the same passage, once in Hebrew and once in Aramaic. It says, now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, this is, as he has conquered Babylon now, this is the first year of him reigning. that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth the Lord God of heaven has given me. So Isaiah sunk in. he got the message. And he has commanded me to build him, God, a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is God, which is in Jerusalem. So we saw, as he's conquering Babylon, he's worshiping Marduk. Now, Ezra records that he's worshiping the God of the Jews. So Isaiah made a big impression. And legend has it, Scripture doesn't say this, and I've not yet found where this is recorded. I think it's actually in the Jewish Talmud, but I'm not sure. But legend has it that Daniel is the one who showed Cyrus the passage out of Isaiah. Josephus records this was known to Cyrus by his reading the book which Isaiah left behind him of his prophecies. For this prophet said that God had spoken thus to him in a secret vision. My will is, that, so this is Josephus talking about Isaiah's message that was given to Cyrus. He said, quote, My will is that Cyrus, whom I have appointed to be king over many and great nations, send back my people to their own land and build my temple. This was foretold by Isaiah 140 years before the temple was demolished. Accordingly, when Cyrus read this and admired the divine power, an earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was written. So he called for the most eminent Jews that were in Babylon and said to them that he might give them leave to go back to their own country and rebuild their city, Jerusalem, and the temple of God, for that he would be their assistant. Cyrus, king of the world. And that he would write to the rulers and governors that were in the neighborhood of their country of Judea that they would contribute to them gold and silver for the building of the temple. And besides that, beasts for their sacrifices. So Cyrus commands not only that the leadership of Israel be sent back and to start rebuilding the temple, as God, he now realizes God has instructed him to do. He says, and I'll be of help, and I will even command the local governors and magistrates to give you guys gold and silver to help in the rebuild. So he's providing financial incentives. He's funding the rebuilding of the temple after this reading from Isaiah. We're told that about 50,000 Jews responded to this first royal proclamation and returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah record the events that take place after this. There's about 4 different big groups of people that go back from Babylon to Israel. But about a year later, as of July 23rd of 537 BC, the returned exiles have gotten the work underway, and the foundations of the new temple have been laid by the spring of 536, which is exactly 70 years after the captivity began in 606 BC, just as Jeremiah had prophesied. A successor of Cyrus, a guy by the name of Artaxerxes Longimanus, or Artaxerxes I, who ruled from 465 to 423, he issues a decree. So Cyrus sends them back to rebuild the temple. And Ezra and Nehemiah record that they have a terrible time doing this because the local enemies keep harassing them. Despite Cyrus's orders, the local guys keep harassing them, and they just can't get anywhere on rebuilding the temple. So Nehemiah, who's in the king's court under Artaxerxes, he takes his life in his hand and goes before the king and actually asks if they can rebuild the wall around the city of Jerusalem so that they can keep the enemies out so that they can then rebuild the temple. And Artaxerxes says yes, and he sends Nehemiah, and the book of Nehemiah records all this. Nehemiah gets on a horse and rides straight through 600 miles. and begins rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem so that they can keep the enemies out, and then the temple can be built. So that's the decree of Artaxerxes to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Those words, that is verse 25 of Daniel chapter 9. And so we're going to come back to that. That decree from Artaxerxes to restore the walls kicks off the 70-week prophecy that appears in Daniel chapter 9. Most important prophecy in the Bible. All right, we're going to quit there. So in the notes, there's some additional history. What becomes of Babylon? One of the most important things to realize is that the Bible, in 3 different places, 3 different pairs of chapters, if you will. If you want some homework, I know you don't, but if you did, read Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51, and Revelation, I think it's 17 and 18. Yeah. Those 6 chapters paint the picture of the destruction of Babylon. And it describes the destruction of Babylon as being utterly laid waste, like the Romans did to Jerusalem in the 120s AD. Not one stone is left upon another. Nothing will ever grow there again. No inhabitant will ever live there again. Nothing. Okay? It's utterly... That's never happened. To this day, there's people living in Babylon, and there have been all along. Okay? It fell into ruin and disrepair, but it also says even the stones of Babylon will never be used again. And throughout its history, since the decline of the ancient empires, since the decline of Alexander, really, when the Romans came through, Babylon began to decline, and some of that history is in my notes. And parts of the city were buried and stuff. But throughout history, people have been mining the stones and reusing them in local structures and rebuilding things on top of there. The Persians built another whole city on top of some of the outer areas of ancient Babylon. So nothing like what the Bible describes in terms of the destruction of Babylon has ever happened. So a lot of commentators get this wrong. You've got to be careful. People confuse the fall of Babylon, which is what we just read about, which happens without a battle, much less any destruction of the city. Don't confuse the fall of Babylon with the destruction. The destruction of Babylon is something that is yet to happen. And the Bible is very clear that it's an end times event when Babylon will again fall, and it uses some very colorful symbolic language in Revelation 17 and 18 and so forth. But it says the whole world will mourn Babylon. This is during the end times, during the tribulation period and so forth. Will mourn the fall of Babylon, and that's when its destruction will be utterly complete. Okay. So as you're reading your commentaries and so forth, don't make the mistake of thinking that the events of Daniel 5 are in any way related to the destruction. This is the fall of Babylon.
Can you list those 6 chapters?
Yeah. Isaiah 13 and 14. So Isaiah 14 is the one where it talks about Satan, Lucifer. That's inside a slightly larger paragraph or section of text about the king of Babylon. Okay? He says to Isaiah, take up a lamentation against the king of Babylon. And in the midst of that, it zooms into Lucifer. But the rest of it is about the destruction of Babylon. So it's one of these double fulfillment prophecies. Isaiah 13 and 14, Jeremiah 50 and 51, that's some of the most detailed language about the destruction of Babylon. Jeremiah 50 and 51. And then Revelation 17 and 18. That's the whole woman that rides the beast, and Babylon is depicted as the great harlot and so forth, and it's very, very symbolic, but that helps us with the timing of the destruction of Babylon. Okay? All right, any questions? Love this chapter. It's so cool to me. Maybe I'm just too geeky, but to find all of this history from secular sources about what's going on from a world history standpoint, with so much detail. It's really uncommon that we have that level of detail about anything that ancient, 500, 600 BC. Okay, and yet these events are just you can picture, you can follow word for word, you can hear the speeches given by the general to the army in what's been written by these guys who were within 100, 200 years of these events happening. So yeah, Kurt.
A couple of questions. First one is, you mentioned that they had enough food to last 20 years in Babylon?
In the city, yeah.
Within the city. Is there any indication of what kinds of food could have lasted that long? Like what kinds of foods they would have prepared?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've not seen a description of that anywhere. I do know that they were able to store grain for long lengths of time, for at least years at a time. I don't know how long they could do that. And it's conceivable that they could have had sustainable flocks going on as well. They can continue, to keep flocks going once they're a certain size. So yeah, great question.
No canned goods or Cheetos.
Yeah, freeze-dried oatmeal and I don't know. The Mormons weren't selling boxed food stores for 20 years supplies back then, but they probably knew an awful lot more about food storage than we do.
My other question was, do you think that if George Bush hadn't captured Saddam Hussein, that Saddam would have completed his
absolutely,
rebuilding?
Yeah, if it hadn't been for if he hadn't made the mistake of invading Kuwait, that was a gamble, and he estimated wrong. He didn't think that the Allies would do anything about it. What was going on was, I've seen this written, some really great histories about this. He was looking at what Germany did in 1939, 38, 39, and by making small, but at least in his mind, warranted reclamations of land that used to be theirs when Germany annexed Poland and the Sudetenland in 39, they were perfectly legal in what they did. And Saddam had claimed that Kuwait had illegally separated from Iraq, and he was just reinforcing original Iraqi borders, and he thought he could get away with it. But then there was this whole oil supply thing and the Allies, and he gambled wrong. But yeah, absolutely. This was ongoing. In fact, some really good books were written. All of the Bible prophecy nuts were going nuts watching as Saddam began rebuilding this stuff, thinking this is it.
People thinking that.
Absolutely. This was huge back in the 90s, late 80s. And I remember there's a book out that I still have on my shelf, I believe, called The Rise of Babylon, which was before the Gulf War started, that chronicled all that he was doing and showed some of these pictures of what he was rebuilding, and then went on to extrapolate and guess where this was going to end up. Well, it didn't work out that way. And especially when he was finally executed, everybody kind of went, oh, well, I guess that wasn't right. But there it sits, at least partially rebuilt. So it's still very, very interesting.
Well, one of the things I read said that one of the major reasons they went to capture him and put him out was because of his, I can't remember.
The genocide was the big, his war crimes against
that he was linked to Al-Qaeda. They believed he was linked to Al-Qaeda,
Yeah.
And 2 years prior was 9/11.
Right.
So that was kind of
It was all connected, yeah. Yeah,
If
you
he's
bet.
linked to Al-Qaeda, we got to snuff him out.
Yeah, because he was clearly on track to taking over the entire Middle East. That's who, you saw last week, he'd minted coins with him and Nebuchadnezzar together, and, he saw himself as the modern day Nebuchadnezzar, and he was going to reestablish the Babylonian Empire with himself as the king. I'll look at that in a little bit. So yeah, absolutely. He was on that track and spending oodles of cash on that stuff. Other questions? All right. Father, we thank you once again for, gosh, what a treasure trove is your entire word. But chapters like this, where we see you at work from beginning to end, through your people, through your appointed, through people that don't even know you. God, you are working behind the scenes at all time, in all things. Work according to your plan and according to your will. Thank you for teaching us to see these things, for opening your word and even our own history, human history before us. We thank you for the discoveries of the archaeologists. We thank you for putting these things together so that we can see how all history proceeds exactly according to your plan. We thank you for this night. We thank you for this group. I thank you that you have brought us together to fellowship over your word. And we thank you for your presence here among us. And I ask that the lessons, there are so many things that we can draw out of this chapter and out of this time together, that your Holy Spirit in our hearts would be the guide to what we remember and what we take forth, and how it draws us to Jesus, whom I believe to be the hand that wrote upon the wall, and how it draws us closer to your word, and ultimately to you, to glorify you with our thoughts, our lives, our hearts, our minds, our spirits. Go with our members, and Father, we lift up those who couldn't be with us tonight, Jim and Andrea and Katie and Kim. We have a number of illnesses among us. We ask for your mercy and grace upon their lives, that you would touch them and heal them. And those that couldn't be with us for other reasons as well, just that you would be with them and that you would continue to build the relationships within this group and to bless our time together as we continue through the book. And go with us now as we return home and through the week. In Jesus' name, we love you and thank you. Amen.